Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Thank you, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. That's Fission, F-I-S-S-I-O-N, because that's what we're living in right now, the Age of Fission. Post-Fukushima, we don't really have a choice. Today is Wednesday, April 13th, and it is my great honor to share with you the conversation information from Mr. Chuck Johnson from Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. So I want to welcome you to the air today, Chuck. I've been very much looking forward to having you with us.
Well, I'm looking forward to it, too. This is great. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I know that the Oregon Physician for Social Responsibility group works on several issues, and you are working on closing down the Columbia Generating Station. Is that correct?
That's right.
So what is going on with that effort to close down CGS, as we call it?
Well, your listeners may be old enough to remember the Washington Public Power Supply System, which was an entity in Washington State of publicly owned utilities that tried to build 5 nuclear plants at the same time. Their initials WPPSS were shortened to WHOOPS. People referred to them as WHOOPS, and this was even before they failed in completing 4 out of the 5 reactors. They've since changed their name to Energy Northwest, and they've continued to operate the 1 reactor they were successful in completing at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. They renamed it. They decided Whoops was not a good name for their organization or for their nuclear plant, and so they renamed it the Columbia Generating Station and took the word nuclear right out of it. This plant is a GE boiling water reactor of similar type to those that melted down in Fukushima, Japan. And so both the Oregon and Washington chapters of Physicians for Social Responsibility formed a joint task force on nuclear power, which I am the director of. A year after Fukushima, we had an anniversary conference in Seattle, and at that conference decided to form a group, a joint effort to close this reactor, and we were joined by local chapters of the Sierra Club, a Portland group that was formed by Occupy people who call themselves No Nukes Northwest, the Alliance for Democracy, Fellowship of Reconciliation, and other individuals throughout Oregon and Washington that have been helping us work on this. At this point, we put out several reports about the geology of the area. It turns out that actually you can have an earthquake that's twice as produces twice as much ground motion at the plant site as the plant was designed to withstand. We did a study of
how much is it planned to withstand?
It's planned to withstand 0.25 Gs. That's a the same type of G force that you're talking about in when you're talking about flying in an aircraft or something.
So what would that be in an earthquake? How big of an earthquake would that be?
Well, this is where it gets difficult to discuss because so much of the time people talk about Richter scale in order to figure out how bad or how big an earthquake is. When they're talking about whether a building is able to withstand something, they translate whatever the size of that earthquake is to how far away it is and the local geology, et cetera, and then they come up with numbers to figure out how much movement there would actually be right at the plant site, and that's where they come up with these figures on G-force movement at the plant site. So what they have discovered is that the entire Hanford area has a number of fairly long and deep fissures from previous Earth movement. One that's as close as 2 miles from the Columbia Generating Station and extends all the way to Puget Sound, actually underneath the Cascade Range. This is another thing they've discovered, is that they didn't ever realize until fairly recently that some of these faults actually extend underneath the Cascade. The longer a fault is, the larger it can be. And if they're deeper and go through different layers, they also have more destructive potential. So the largest earthquake they've recorded in the area was about 100 miles away to the north on the east side of the Cascades, and it was a 7.2 on the Richter scale, which is a pretty big earthquake. So when they originally sited the plant, in order to reduce the amount of effort they'd have to put into reinforcing the plant, geologists that were hired by WOPS conveniently determined that earthquake was all the way up on the Canadian border, even though it actually wasn't, and that's since has been determined that it wasn't. And as a result, they didn't have to build the plant to withstand more ground motion. Now that they've acknowledged that larger earthquake was much closer, and it needs to be the earthquake upon which they base, all of their statistics, they now know that, and the NRC has actually acknowledged as of a year ago that NRC meaning the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which regulates the plant, they've acknowledged this fact, and they've given Energy Northwest 3 years to figure out what they're going to do about it. And typical of the NRC, they don't ever actually, they don't enforce their regulations. They help. Generally, they're an enabling agency rather than an enforcement agency. They help utilities figure out economical ways to make their plants maybe slightly safer, but they never take actions that would cause the plant to close down. This is actually well documented. There's really only one case in which a license for a nuclear power plant was denied by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that was the Zimmer plant in Ohio, out of 350 or so applications. So that's quite a track record.
So when they say that they never have seen a license they didn't like, that's actually true. In other words, so what's the process for closing Columbia Generating Station? Like, what is the projection? How, if there's so many obstacles in the way? I know Mimi has been on our show before and explained that there are more than a dozen agencies involved in basically the structure of the Columbia Generating Station, correct?
Yes. So yeah, the NRC is not the pathway. They could decide that this plant wasn't safe enough to continue operating, and shut it down, but they will not do that. So really, it's going to have to be done by the owners, which gets to be complicated because, as I said, this Washington Public Power Supply System was trying to build these 5 plants, and they had an agreement for this particular plant and 2 others that weren't finished with Bonneville Power Administration called the Net Billing Agreement. And under that agreement, Bonneville agreed to pay all of their bills, regardless of whether the plants were actually built or not or anything else. So we're actually, Bonneville ratepayers are paying for 2 of those nuclear plants that were never finished. About 17% of people's Bonneville rates go toward paying the debt on 2 plants that were never completed. Then another.
How is it that could happen? How did that one get worked out? Explain that to as a ratepayer. How is it that we get billed for something that we don't even have? Well,
it was the way that they initially wanted to. These utilities, which there were 92 utilities that bought shares of the Columbia, what's now the Columbia Generating Station. It was called Whoops 2 at the time. Because they didn't have experience in building nuclear projects or anything that big, they wanted some sort of guarantee that if things went wrong, they wouldn't be left holding the bag individually as utilities, but collectively through Bonneville. It would, and Bonneville wanted them to build these plants. They thought that the electricity was going to be needed. It turned out that once the price of electricity started going up, people stopped using as much of it, and the growth of electricity use in the Northwest flattened out. So they really didn't need to build these plants after all. But they still were stuck with the bill for the unfinished plants, and we've been paying it. And part of it is that they've been refinancing that debt. They've been like a lot of people, with their own home mortgages. If you find that you can get a better rate, or you can extend the payments so that it's less each year, then you do that. Well, that Bonneville has done that. Bonneville and Energy Northwest, in cooperation, have done that so that they can not have the rates shoot up so high, and even at an extended period of time to pay these debts off, it's still a significant amount. Like I said, about 17% of the bill.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So, yeah, it's a lot.
And there's no provision to force them to declare bankruptcy at a certain point. They just can keep adding that cost on for as long as they want.
Well, they're required to pay it off. If Bonneville declared bankruptcy, that would be a huge problem generally because they operate the dams and everything else.
Oh, Lord.
So you really wouldn't want that.
Wow.
But the Columbia Generating Station is about 18% of the cost. It has its debt, and then it has its operating expenses, which are significant. They're much higher than the operating expenses of the dams.
So let me ask, you said that the Columbia Generating Station was built in the 70s. I think you said 72. Didn't you say that?
They started in 72 and they finished it in 1983.
But you're saying that we're still paying off the debt of building that. It has not paid for itself since then, since the 80s till now?
Yeah, that's right. It's the same principle. They could have paid it off by now, but they've extended the debt out to cushion the annual amount they have to raise rates to pay it.
Doesn't this just, this is an aside, but doesn't it just infuriate you, the lack of regard for the ratepayers? Forget the physical damage that they're doing, but it's almost like they're doing a double whammy up here in the Northwest. It's like they're charging people extra money to poison them. Well, but that's true around the country. This is true.
Nuclear power turned out to be really uneconomical, and it forced up electricity rates around the country, and it's one of the reasons why so many of them got stranded, because as the rates went up, surprise, people decided to conserve and use less electricity, and now we don't need them. Oh my God, what's going on? And only about half of them got finished. They were having construction problems because they were building these things before they were done designing them. Most of these plants got started while they were still working in the design phase.
Whose brilliant idea was that, though? How did that happen? Who starts a gigantic
That happened because
project?
they were in a rush. Well, they were in a rush. This is the United States and really Western civilization is in a giant hurry to bring every innovation it can out as quickly as possible. That's how we end up with pesticides that we don't study thoroughly, and then we find out later cause harm. This is just of a type. This is how some new idea is brought forward before it's fully cooked, and that's just typical of our society, unfortunately. And it's had really bad consequences in the nuclear power area. Along with a number of other areas, but
yeah. Well, the sad part is that they get to pay scientists to basically lie for them. I mean, it's like the same thing with the GMO industry, right? We've had years and years and years and years of scientists telling us it was okay, and then just exactly this week, actually, there was an article out that said scientists now admit that GMOs actually do cause cancer. It's like it's a direct correlation to it. So this is a shocking, for me as a citizen who became aware of this just a few years ago because of Fukushima, I have to say, like living in the Northwest, looking at the Columbia Generating Station and recognizing that it really presents a threat to the entire region. Mm-hmm. I'm dumbfounded that our elected officials are not taking the threat more seriously. I mean,
I am too. Yeah.
When I know that you're constantly working and interfacing with these government agencies. When you discuss these, you came out in 2013, you did a presentation here in Eugene where I met you actually last year. Mm-hmm. And it was quite impressive, your presentation, where you had pictures of old plutonium plants that were moved, and you were talking about how all these explain to the listeners again how many entities are involved as stakeholders at the Columbia Generating Station.
Okay, well, as I said, there were 92 utilities that bought little shares of it. Some of them, I think the largest one was 15% from Snohomish PUD, which is a county just north of Seattle. And a couple of them bought 7%, 6%, and then a bunch of them bought even, 0.5%, some tiny slices. And it's not just Washington utilities, but also in Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, California.
Wow.
Little tiny utilities that are part of the Bonneville network. So after the Whoops financial collapse, and I didn't mention this, but 2 of the 5 reactors weren't under this net billing agreement. So basically these utilities were holding the bag for these failing nuclear plants, and they did default on their bonds. They decided that they were not going to pay them. It's the largest municipal bond default in the United States up to that point, over $2 billion, and the bondholders lost all their money. So this was shocking. But anyway, the state legislature in Washington decided that Whoops was too unwieldy with all these, utilities owning confusing numbers of shares, and they reorganized it. And there's now a board. Whoops became 27 utilities that were either PUDs or municipal utilities in Washington state, and that's their board. And that board selects a majority of the members of the executive board, which is the decision maker. The governor appoints 3 members of the executive board. The overall board selects 6 members. So that executive board then is the one that that manages and supervises the staff, the management that runs the Columbia Generating Station, and then negotiates with Bonneville over, what costs Bonneville will cover. And Bonneville is required to cover all of them. So if they want to repair something, though, they have to negotiate with Bonneville. If there's a big expense, they sometimes can go through years of negotiation with Bonneville over whether or not Bonneville is going to allow them to spend it. So Bonneville also has the right to close this plant because there's been enough. They were required to buy the power, and they didn't then have any control over it in any way, unless a certain percentage of money was spent repairing the plant. And once that threshold was reached, then Bonneville had the right to say that this thing was no longer economical and we can close it. So this is something that we've been pointing out to Bonneville, and it's something they don't want to notice because basically, unless there are some utilities in the region calling for its shutdown, it would be too politically risky for them to advocate closing the Columbia Generating Station, even though it's costing them money significantly every year.
Why would that be politically risky? Tell me why that would be politically risky.
Okay, well, it sort of starts in the Tri-Cities, which, of course, its economy ever since the 40s has been based on atomic everything. It was involved in building the reactor, the first reactor, and then a whole series of reactors that produced plutonium for our nuclear weapons arsenal. It created the plutonium that was used to kill tens of thousands of people in Nagasaki. That was its first product, and it continued then through the entire Cold War, generating enormous amounts of plutonium and employing a lot of workers, unionized workers, I might point out. So this is another way in which Democratic politicians get pressured to allow things to continue in the Hanford area, in the nuclear area, is that the workforce has been heavily unionized. The Columbia Generating Station is all union employees. So that puts pressure on Democratic politicians to, respect those jobs, and that's actually probably been politically the most difficult hurdle to overcome.
Yeah,
is what do we do about those workers, and how do we help them? And we're grappling with that. We're actually trying to put forth a plan that would deal with the 1,000 workers at the plant.
Well, that to me, I find that I heard that same argument when I was talking to Donna Gilmore. That was one of the issues down at San Onofre, right? But to me, we're talking about a unionized set of workers working in an industry that does nothing that brings death. I mean, I can't even imagine that those are jobs. These are. I find that stunning that we are willing to keep open a death plant, basically, because there's 1,000 workers there.
Right. I mean, and those workers are at greater risk than anyone. That's the thing. But of course, it's as with all of these nuclear facilities. When someone gets ill, they don't want to ascribe the illness to the plant, and they certainly don't want their workers studied. They don't want any of it looked at.
Well, look at recently the microencephaly. I mean, that's an infuriating thing. There's been a report that there's high incidence of microencephaly up there near Hanford in the Columbia Generating Station. And the reports come out that the government is consistently finding reasons to say it's not caused by that.
Right. Yeah.
So it's doing to the general public what it does to the nuclear workers, essentially. Anybody living in that area is just ignored. Their medical needs are completely ignored.
Well, a lot of the pathway is through the workers. That they bring materials out off the plant site into the rest of the community. But it's so anyway, it's an entire community though that's more or less captured by this industry and by denial of its danger.
Right.
And still advocating expansion of it. I mean, for years they fought trying to keep facilities open at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, and failing that, now they're trying to be the place where small modular reactors are produced, and they want to build more of these small mini nukes right next to the Columbia Generating Station. They're prohibited by state law at this point from doing that, but they're introducing legislation in Olympia to try to allow them to go ahead and do that without a public vote. Right now, you'd have to have a public vote on whether or not you'd expend money on a nuclear plant out there, and they want to get around that. They don't want the public voting on that. They want to just be able to do it.
Who's submitting that legislation?
Senator Sheldon, who is on the Energy Northwest board. He's one of the public members that was appointed by the board to serve on the executive board, and he represents Mason County in the Washington State Legislature. He's a Democrat, but he's been voting with Republicans. They have a coalition that runs the state Senate of conservative Democrats and Republicans, and he's in that coalition. So that legislation went nowhere, though, because we blew the whistle on that. We came in, and a guy named Steve Zemke, who was the author of the initiative in 1981 that required the public vote before you build a plant larger than 250 megawatts, based on the experience with Whoops, came in and pointed out that this was a totally unnecessary end around, and they realized that the kind of publicity they would get for trying to pass that law wouldn't be very good, so they didn't even pass it in the Senate, where they would have had the votes, and they wouldn't have had the votes in the House. Anyway, because it's so blatantly anti-democratic. If something is if they think nuclear power is wonderful, surely they would think that they would be able to convince the voters of Washington that it's a wonderful idea, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, what are they afraid of?
Right.
So they realized how bad it looked, and they didn't even try to pass it in the Senate. But that doesn't mean they won't try again sometime. We have to keep an eye on them.
Well, that's where you come in, and your organizations come in, because you keep that watchful eye over these over the government and over things. Well, we're just out here busy working. It's just stunning that we have to really look over their shoulders all the time. You'd think that they would make decisions that are helpful, not harmful.
You would think. We have gotten some help recently, though. We've been trying to lobby unsuccessfully thus far these utilities that are part of this 27-member board. And we've been working on Seattle, focusing on Seattle. Seattle City Light is one of those utilities. It's a municipal utility that is run by the city of Seattle. And so, therefore, the city council and the mayor are the ultimate authorities over the utility. And, of course, they're elected officials. So we have been working with the city council, with the council member Shama Sawant, who is the chair of the Energy Committee, to put forth a resolution that sets as policy that Seattle City Light would work toward the closure of the Columbia Generating Station. And at this point, it looks as though we may be able to get that through this year with the support of the mayor. The general manager, who was recently hired by the mayor to run City Light, had experience in Austin, Texas, with nuclear, and he does not think it's economically very sound. So he was more sympathetic to us than the previous general manager. This is still in the works. Don't write the headline yet. But,
right. When you're talking about closing it down, how long are you looking at? Like, what would the length of time be that it would be worked towards being closed down?
Well, if we had our way, we'd close it tomorrow, because this reactor is an accident waiting to happen. It's a known faulty design. We know what can happen. We saw it happen in Japan. There are many pathways by which you can constrict the cooling water or the electricity necessary to run this plant. And if enough things go wrong, you don't have control over this reactor, and you don't have a lot of time to get it back under control because of this narrow containment in these GE reactors. They're small, and the water boils away fairly quickly, and then you can start having a meltdown. So we know that about this plant, and as far as we're concerned, it needs to be shut down today. Mm-hmm. Economically, we had an economist look at what this plant was costing the region, and what it would, what would make sense to do. And if you're just looking at pure economics, the time to close the reactor is at the end of a fuel cycle, because a lot of the expense in running a nuclear power plant is when it's shut down. When it's not generating any electricity, it's nothing but cost, obviously. And so you shut it down, you change out the fuel, fix it up to the extent that you know you need to do it, and then you turn it back on again. So right when you're at the point where you need to do that is the smart time to shut it down, because the rest of the time that it's running, it's actually coming closer to paying for itself. It either is paying for itself or it's not costing you as much. So what he had proposed was that they shut it down, that they put out for bid replacing the Columbia Generating Station. Because in the Mid-Columbia market, where there's a power market, and there are a number of different suppliers, hydro dams, natural gas plants, wind generators, that competitively sell their electricity on the market. And there's been a surplus for a while in the Northwest, and Robert McCullough, our economist, was saying that if you just simply bid it out and, maybe bid 5 and 10 year contracts for power, you could beat the price of the Columbia Generating Station and save the region some money. And so far, his projections of what it would cost us the last 3 years, it's been 3 years since his study came out, he's been spot on the money. Exactly. Wow. His predictions have worked out exactly correctly.
Is that helping you in your efforts to lobby these people to close this?
It helped us with with Seattle City Light, finally. It's been slow, though, because the influence of the Tri-Cities on the public power movement has been enormous. Most of the utilities around the Tri-Cities are publicly owned utilities.
What are the Tri-Cities? You've said that twice. What are the Tri-Cities?
Tri-Cities are Richland, Pasco, and Kennewick, and those are the towns around Hanford.
Okay.
Whose economy revolves around Hanford. It's now 150,000 people who live in that region. Wow.
Do most of them work at the plant or at Hanford?
Well, if they don't, they have relatives who do, mm-hmm. or they have their customers do. So really, it is sort of the lifeblood between agriculture and the nuclear work are the main industries out there.
There's agriculture right next to this nuclear power plant.
That's a problem, yeah, and that's of course an inherent conflict, but it's not one that they like to talk about in town because there's so many people who are employed at the at Hanford.
Chuck, I think the reason that these nuclear power plants are allowed to stay open, it has to do with the complicity of the American Medical Association. They really do refuse to make good tracking of how people are sick, where they live when they were exposed. Like, this example of what happened in St. Louis, these people on Facebook discovered themselves that they were victims of nuclear pollution on Facebook by notating the fact that these were very educated people. Some were doctors, and they went, wow, that's weird that you have I'm living in Chicago. Our only common denominator is we went to school together and we lived right next to Coldwater Creek. That's how they discovered it. So that's what I mean. I don't mean to be rude about the physicians, but I really think that part of how in fact, the whole technology industry has gotten away with these crimes against humanity is the fact that we are not tracking how, for example.
That's right. We don't fund epidemiology. epidemiology or epidemiological studies.
Nothing.
That's not individual doctors' fault. That's society in a sense.
Well,
doctors
that's the AMA.
collectively should be demanding it.
That's why I said not the doctors. It's the AMA. It's the status quo of going along to get along. Like, this is what we're asked to do, so that's all we're going to do, instead of saying, as physicians, as a group of an organization, we have a responsibility to accurately report these findings. And that has been the big missing gap, besides the fact that the media refuses to report on it.
Yeah. Well, Lonnie, the one most recent terrible example is Nuclear Regulatory Commission was going to be doing a study around all of the nuclear plants, there are 99 nuclear plants in the United States, to do this, basically the same study that's been done now in Germany, France, and Great Britain, to see if there are cancer clusters around these nuclear plants. And they had decided they were going to do that. And then suddenly, this year they decided we don't have enough money to do that, and it just isn't cost effective to do that.
Right.
We're not likely to find, much of significance. That's total BS. They know they're likely to be able to replicate what was found, which is that there's greater amounts of childhood leukemia around all of these plants, and that's a real clear indicator of something that would not be occurring without something like a nuclear plant in its midst. And this is even France, as nuclear dependent as they are, matched those results and has been willing to actually look at this issue. The United States is still willingly blind as to what exactly is happening around its operating nuclear reactors.
Every single one of them. I met a girl in school who grew up 35 miles away from Hanford. She was born with a hole in her heart, because she had this big thing, and she said something. She was telling us and I said, well, where were you born? She said, well, pretty close to Hanford. And I'm like, well, that's an indication of nuclear pollution contaminating in utero. That's a common thing. I read Dr. Goffman's book. He said that's a very common thing for babies that are exposed to radiation to have a hole in their heart. I mean, these days we can repair it, but that's an indicator. She said to me, the doctor never even mentioned it. No one ever talked about it. You're the first person in my entire life to tell me I might have been affected by Hanford.
Right. I mean, there was an awful lot of contamination out of Hanford, particularly in the early days when they were doing nothing to prevent it. They were even intentionally releasing iodine. They had a thing called the Green Run just to see, what would happen with the radioactive iodine gas they released, and they followed it around. They intentionally sent out an enormous amount of it and affected people's thyroids in the area around there. There's an enormous amount of thyroid problem around the Hanford site that has never been adequately documented by epidemiologists, but is well known in the community. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship that people have in the community toward those plants. It's given them a lot of good money,
right?
And they like that part, but of course they worry about the exposure, and especially once a family member comes down with a cancer or a health problem of some sort, a lot of times they realize where it came from, more so than is acknowledged by the authorities, that's for sure. So in terms of progress, you were asking me about that earlier.
Yes.
The other thing that's happened that has really shaken things up is that starting last fall, a group of whistleblowers started getting organized. We didn't know about this or hear anything about it until via a reporter at the Oregonian, Ted Sickinger, contacted me, and he said that he was in contact with somebody or somebodies at the plant who was questioning whether or not they had some of the things they'd done during the fuel outage had caused a fuel leak at the plant. And then he wrote a story about it, and didn't cite the whistleblowers. He kept them anonymous still at that point. But then these whistleblowers were still not satisfied that management was taking the problems at the plant seriously enough, and felt that they were hiding it from the board. So they started getting a little more bold and writing more strident letters to Sickinger, and then to other reporters, and then eventually sent one to us.
Wow.
And to several board members, and it just kind of started sending this letter in which it outlined how the management was hiding the bad results from the plant from the board. And this blew up in a board meeting at the end of January, where several board members were really upset and felt that they had been misled by management, that the plant operation had been improving when actually it had been deteriorating. And so now there is a study being done, an investigation being done by a Washington, D.C. law firm associated with the nuclear industry, not a very independent group, looking into it. The executive board appointed this study, and its results are supposed to be out at the end of the month, but it looks like a whitewash. But nonetheless, I still believe, and my indications are that there are a number of members of the board that aren't satisfied that this study has really looked at the problem, and do feel that they've been misled by the management, and it's shaken their faith in the management. So that's helpful to us, obviously. Mm-hmm. Our credibility, I think, went up significantly because it wasn't just an anti-nuclear group that wants to close the plant that's saying that there are problems at the plant. These are actual workers at the plant.
That's a big step for them to take. Have there been any recriminations, do you know, against any of those people?
Not yet. They haven't been found, and they're trying to find them, definitely. The current thing that's happening is this Pillsbury law firm is talking with plant workers about creating an atmosphere where people aren't fearful to go and talk to the managers about what's going on and what their concerns are. And of course, this is another way to get people to smoke themselves out and then identify themselves as malcontents and get forced out.
Right, exactly.
So,
yeah.
Right. So, I think these whistleblowers are smart enough to know that that's what's going on and aren't going to say, oh, you're going to open up channels so that we can have honest conversations.
You're gonna
well,
help
here's
us.
all the problems I see. And,
exactly.
Oh, okay, you're the whistleblower. Good. See you later.
Yeah, yeah.
We're sorry that it didn't work out.
Well, it's really obvious that the law firm they've hired is one that will help them frame it in the way. I mean, people hire a law firm to sell their point, not really to find the truth.
True.
And that's the reality. And those workers, and they know it. They're on the inside. But this is a point I wanted to bring up to you. Columbia Generating Station is very close to Hanford, isn't it? Isn't that part of what makes it a massive threat?
Well, it's on the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. It's a tiny strip of land that extends from the Columbia River to inland to where the plant is located, and two other unfinished plants are located. It was designed to be 3 plants right there at that site, and the one was completed. Actually right next to the parking lot of the Columbia Generating Station is a Hanford waste dump, the 61811 burial ground, where they took a bunch of experimental, really highly radioactive materials from the 300 area, where they were doing a lot of sort of experimental work in little factories they built there to try and design new things for their bomb making projects, and just dumped it into the ground without a lot of care. At the time, they thought that there was what they called a vadose zone, a dry area below the surface of the Hanford area that was that rainwater didn't go through. That the rainwater was so that it was so dry out there that rainwater didn't connect to the groundwater on the Hanford Reservation, which is totally untrue. That's not true at all. But that was their mythology and how they sort of justified just dumping stuff in the ground and not worrying about it.
Wow.
So anyway, this is one of the hottest spots in the entire nuclear reservation, and if they dig it up, it would be very hazardous for the workers there. They've got a real dilemma. They really ought not to disturb it without shutting the plant down. But of course, they don't plan on shutting the plant down until 2043. Now they got a 20-year extension of its license from 2023 to 2043. So this shows one way in which this plant site negatively interacts with the Hanford Reservation.
How far away is it? You said it's right next door. How far away when you say next to it?
How far away is what?
This dump site, these contaminants from the Columbia Generating Station.
It's literally if you drive up to the reactor, you drive right past this burial ground, go through the gates, and park. And where you park, it abuts the burial ground. It's right next to it.
Kind of like what they have in St. Louis. St. Louis, they have this burial ground of nuclear waste right next door to the airport, surrounded by about 300,000 houses. It's the same.
Yeah,
insanity.
This is there aren't any houses out there, but all the workers park their cars right next to the dump. So, and it's affecting the local groundwater there. You know, they have groundwater wells, and they're radioactive. You can't tell how much of the tritium is caused by the plant and how much of it's caused by dump sites in the area. But that's one thing. It sort of masks the all of the releases of radioactivity from the CGS are dwarfed by how much has been released by these production reactors. So it's kind of hard to tell. If you were to try to calculate health effects in the region, you would never be able to know what the Columbia Generating Station had caused versus all of the contamination from the production reactors for nuclear weapons. And there are a couple of sites on the Hanford Reservation that could have a catastrophic release of material. The worst of them is the waste encapsulation and storage facility, which has strontium and cesium capsules in the bottom of a pool, a concrete pool, that was not built very sturdily. And it was built in the 1970s before they really had thought about what the real earthquake problems were out there. And according to the Office of Inspector General of the U.S. Department of Energy, it is the most dangerous site in the entire nuclear weapons complex, because if you had a crack in the pool due to an earthquake, water could drain away and the cesium and strontium would ignite and send particles airborne throughout the Hanford Reservation that would and beyond, that would be intensely radioactive. If the wind were blowing the wrong way, you might have to evacuate the Columbia Generating Station just to protect people from getting exposures. So that's obviously not something you'd want to have happen. So that there are potential interactions if you had an accident at either or both of those. If you had an earthquake that caused a meltdown at the Columbia Generating Station and a release from the waste encapsulation and storage facility, that would be a true nightmare scenario. That would be like Fukushima, where you had multiple reactors that were melting down simultaneously.
It's so insane.
You have potential for that.
It's like an accident waiting to happen. Like they know what's going to happen, and the likelihood of it happening seems great. Just after our brief conversation, it appears to me that the scientists must know the risk is extremely high.
It really varies. Some, and I think it depends on who's paying who's writing your paycheck.
Wow.
As to how much risk you think is reasonable. who aren't getting their paychecks from either the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or Energy Northwest tend to be more conservative and think that these things are more risky and we should do something about them. And oddly enough, the people who get paychecks from the scientists who get paychecks from the Columbia Generating Station or from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission are less concerned about it. So
wow.
we don't know. That geology is a very inexact science. We can't predict earthquakes. But what we've seen is that a black swan event, as they call them, an unusual event, happens fairly often. We don't know which one it's going to be. We don't know what form it will take. But we've had 3 accidents in the big accidents in the nuclear industry since the commercial nuclear age started. One of which, the 3 Mile Island accident, was mostly contained. There was some release of radioactive material that they don't like to talk about, but reactor was ruined. Chernobyl, obviously, uncontained, massive contamination.
Still
and
a mess.
Fukushima, it's still a mess. Fukushima, same thing.
Yeah.
So,
Fukushima is actually worse than Chernobyl. It's actually a nuclear volcano. Fukushima is a nuclear volcano that they...
Currently, right. I agree.
It's so outrageous. And this is the stunning part for me when you talk to any of these officials on these boards, like that they can disconnect those facts from what they're approving for this region. I mean, anybody who pays attention to it understands that the Columbia Generating Station needs to be closed down now, and the NRC just approved it till the, mid-40s. Does anybody actually really believe we're going to go till the mid-40s with no major earthquake up in the Northwest? I don't.
Seems like a risky bet, doesn't it?
I mean, it's like, frankly, it reminds me of Caligula. These people make Caligula look like an infant, in my view. I mean, I'm
Caligula was pretty bad.
These people are worse than Caligula, Chuck. I mean, when you look at the destruction and death that they have done, our oceans are dying. I mean, our ecosystem is dying. This is not something, and it's something that we can't see, taste, smell, or touch. I mean, we are all being affected every single day, whether we like to admit it or not. And they're not even really looking for solutions. They're just twisting like pretzels, trying to figure out a way to cover it up.
Yeah.
I have to say, it's what drives me. I'm on the radio 3 times a week. I'm nonplussed at the inhumanity of it all. So let me. You have Oregon Physician for Social Responsibility. Before we went on the air, you were talking to me that you work very closely with nuclearfreenorthwest.org, correct?
Yes. If people want more information about this, the place to go is nuclearfreenw.org. That's nuclearfreenw.org. And you can see all the information and more about the Columbia Generating Station that I've talked about today. It's a website that's maintained by our coalition, and I think it's very complete. A lot of good information.
It is. It looks really awesome. How many people are involved, would you say, in this coalition? Like how many actual bodies of people are actually actively engaged?
There's a core group of probably around 40 or maybe 50 people who we have a listserv that people communicate with one another on, and there's about that many who actively participate in that. And then there's a larger group of people who get activated for specific actions. For example, last year we made an attempt in Seattle to try to pass the resolution, and unfortunately we did not have the support of the mayor then, which we discovered, but we had hundreds of people contact the city council and the mayor, and of course each of these individual organizations that are part of the coalition have hundreds and thousands of people involved. So, we have a bench of supporters that that we try to call on to help us from time to time. We're not, unfortunately, because nuclear power, the problems with it have come to the forefront at a time when we're also facing this climate change, huge problem with climate change. We don't have the numbers that people who are fighting climate change do, or not even close. And in fact, of course, one of the best arguments that the other side has against us is that the carbon footprint for nuclear is less than even natural gas.
I contest that. I don't think that's a real true story. The carbon footprint.
Well,
look at the uranium mining that goes into the carbon footprint. The uranium mining.
No,
alone,
I agree. It has a larger carbon footprint than wind or solar, which they don't want to admit.
It has a larger
but it's
carbon
still less
footprint.
than natural gas.
No.
Natural gas releases methane. Don't forget that.
Yes.
When you're talking about fracked natural gas, it releases a lot of methane. And
it does release
methane is an even worse. Well, methane is an even worse climate gas than CO2 in the short run.
Well, this is my contention, is that, well, we might be worrying about the climate. If you destroy the environment, if we destroy our capacity to reproduce, through the nuclear pollution, I contend that nuclear pollution is probably the greatest threat on our planet. I know that we have the climate change, the escaping methane gas. Many people have seen the methane, that YouTube video called The Methane Time Bomb and the Arctic Death Spiral that very clearly explains the threat of the methane. But when you look at what nuclear does to our DNA and our capacity to reproduce, we won't need a climate if we can't reproduce and there's no animals viable on this planet. And that's what nuclear
I'm agreeing
us.
with you. Obviously I've chosen to work on this issue because I think it's extremely important. And part of it is also that in our rush to prevent climate catastrophe, we don't need to go running off and doing something stupid like building a lot of new nuclear plants or running these dangerous ones for extra lengths of time that put us at risk.
Right.
So that, knowing that, I feel like this is an important role and a niche for people like you and me and our listeners to fill, is to remind the environmental movement that they don't need to be like the old lady who swallowed the fly and then swallows a spider and a cat and a bunch of other things in order to get rid of her original problem. We don't need to be idiotic in our opposition to climate change by doing something else that harms us. The German plan for dealing with both nuclear power and climate change is the most intelligent national plan that any large industrial nation has put forward. And that's what we ought to be doing in the United States, is figuring out how to get off of nuclear power, how to get off of coal, and how to get off of natural gas. Just get rid of all of them. None of them are any good. Let's do it, and stop trying to find excuses as to why we can't do that.
Well, Chuck, on that, I'm going to let you have the last word on that. We have 30 seconds left. I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I hope you will come back again to join us. Chuck, this is Chuck Johnson from Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I want to thank you for working to close down the Columbia Generating Station. I know it's not an easy task, so thank you for joining us.
Well, it's really my pleasure, and I'd love to come back on. So thank you for having me on. This is great.
Thank you so much. And I encourage all my listeners, put your courage feet on, take some action, go to these websites, Nuclear North.